Number 10. The legal escapes. Picture the Old Bailey in London, 1670. A pirate stands in the dock, hands tied at the wrists, the noose already knotted somewhere in a shed behind Newgate Prison waiting for him. The evidence against him is overwhelming. Witnesses have testified. The Admiralty flag has been carried into the chamber on a silver oar. The judge asks for any final plea, and the pirate opens his mouth and speaks 12 words in Latin. Miserere, me Deus, secundum misericordiam, tuum iuxta, multitudinem miseratium tuarum deli iniquitates meas. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. And just like that, he walks. Not free exactly, but not to the gallows. Because he has just claimed the benefit of clergy, an ancient English legal loophole that transferred cases from secular courts to ecclesiastical ones. The church didn't hang people, not for a first offense. Not even for piracy. The theory went that if you could read Latin, you must be a member of the clergy, and the king had no jurisdiction over God's servants. The practice was rather different, because the passage the court asked defendants to read was always the same, 1 Psalm 51, verse 3. And every literate man, and eventually every illiterate man with a good memory, learned it by heart. It became known as the neck verse, because knowing it could save your neck, between 1612 and 1614. In Middlesex alone, 204 men were sentenced to death for a first offense. 95 of them recited Psalm 51 and lived. To prevent them from doing it twice, the courts branded them on the thumb and M for murder, a T for theft, a P for piracy. But one mark on one thumb was a small price to pay for keeping your head above your shoulders. The literacy test wasn't abolished until 1706, and benefit of clergy itself lingered until 1827. That was loophole number 1. Loophole number 2 was more direct. It was money. Colonial jails were rickety, understaffed, and staffed by men who earned little and were paid less, and pirates arrived at them with pockets full of foreign silver. Jailbreaks, in support of alleged pirates, were common throughout the British Empire in the late 1600s, sometimes organized by colonial officials themselves, sometimes by fathers-in-law of the accused. In Philadelphia, in 1730, an entire mutinous crew stood condemned for piracy. Their ringleader escaped from custody. The remaining 4 received pardons, and Philadelphians looked the other way because merchants in the Delaware Valley had been supplying pirates with ammunition and provisions for years. William Markham, deputy governor of Pennsylvania, allegedly accepted a bribe from the pirate Henry Every himself, and later allowed one of his daughters to marry the man. In 1718, Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina pardoned Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, in exchange for a share of his sizable booty. When Blackbeard returned from a supposedly retired life to capture 2 French ships off Bermuda, Eden's court ruled that the pirate had merely salvaged the cargo of derelict vessels. A few barrels of sugar changed hands. The Admiralty, in London, complained bitterly that its officials in the far-flung outposts of the empire could be bribed, which is precisely why for years it insisted that pirates be shipped all the way back to England for trial. The neck verse and the bribe. Between them, they emptied more gallows than any prison break in history. Which brings us to the pirates who escaped without lawyers. Number 9, William Oakley. In the summer of 1639, a small English merchant vessel bound for the Puritan colony of Providence Island off the coast of Nicaragua sighted 3 fast-moving sails on the horizon. Within an hour, they were surrounded. Within 2, they were boarded. And within a week, William Oakley, an English Puritan fleeing religious persecution, was standing in chains in the slave market of Algiers, being examined for age, muscle, and teeth by men who would sell him for the price of a bad horse. What follows is the greatest escape ever made from the pirate world rather than by it. And it began not with a fight, but with a lie. Oakley served 4 different masters over the next 5 years. He worked as a childminder, a weaver, a hand aboard an Algerian corsair ship, and finally as a small-time shopkeeper. The corsair economy of Algiers was strange. Many slaves were allowed to roam freely inside the city walls, provided they returned to their masters at night and paid a monthly cut of whatever they earned. The city itself was the prison. The Mediterranean beyond the harbor was the fence. Oakley set up a small tavern selling alcohol and other goods, and beneath the floorboards of that tavern, he began building something that no captive in Algiers had ever built. He built a boat, not a big one, a canvas one, in secret, in pieces, in a cellar, working alongside 4 other Englishmen named William Adams, John Anthony, John Jeffs, and a carpenter whose name was left blank. In the record, he framed a boat from smuggled ribs of wood no longer than the length of a tall man's arms, outstretched and stretched over it a skin of canvas smeared with pitch and tallow to keep the water out. He designed it to come apart into sections small enough to smuggle out of the city gates, hidden under baskets of firewood and heaps of laundry. When the pieces finally lay on the sand outside the walls, in the dark in June 1644, they had to be assembled by feel because a lantern would have brought guards down on them within seconds. 5 men, 1 canvas boat, 150 miles of Mediterranean Sea between them and the nearest Christian coast. They pushed off into the darkness with 2 pairs of oars and no sail. For 5 days they rowed. The sea rose and threatened to swallow them. Their tongues swelled from thirst. Fish struck the underside of the canvas, and they flinched, thinking every time it was the hull tearing. On the 6th day, they sighted land. It was the island of Majorca. When Oakley finally reached England again in September of 1644, more than 5 years after his capture, he wrote his story down and titled it Ebenezer, or A Small Monument of Great Mercy. He described the boat, the cellar, the smuggling, the sea, and the trembling hands that stitched canvas by candlelight in a slave city. He did not brag. He gave the credit to God. But every reader who worked through it understood one thing clearly: a shopkeeper in a slave apron had outpirated the pirates who owned him. Number 8, Nathaniel North. If any one man in the history of the Indian Ocean deserved the title escape artist, it was the Bermudian pirate Nathaniel North. Born in Tuckerstown on the island of Bermuda around 1671, North left home at the age of 17 as a cook aboard a Bermuda sloop bound for Barbados. On arrival, he was press-ganged into the Royal Navy of King William III. A press gang was one of the most feared institutions in the 18th century Atlantic. It was, put simply, the legalized kidnapping of any able-bodied man the Navy could catch, dragging him aboard a warship and forcing him to serve for years without pay or leave. North's response to being press-ganged that first time set the tone for the rest of his life. He jumped overboard in Barbados Harbor and swam ashore. Escape number 1 by open water swimming. A few years later, having survived as a smuggler and a privateer, he found himself in Jamaica, where the press gangs got him a second time. He jumped over the side again and swam ashore again. Some accounts insist he outsmarted no fewer than 3 separate press gangs in a single night on that occasion, disappearing into the alleys of Port Royal each time. By 1696, North was quartermaster aboard the 18-gun brigantine Pelican, part of a crew that abandoned its privateering commission and sailed instead for Madagascar to hunt Moor and Mughal treasure. In 1698, the Pelican joined forces with Robert Culliford and Dirk Chivers to capture the Great Muhammad in the Red Sea, one of the richest single prizes of the entire golden age of piracy, 130,000 pounds in gold coins. North's share was modest because the Pelican had joined the fight late, but he had bigger problems ahead. In early 1700, a squadron of British warships under Commodore Thomas Warren arrived at the pirate haven on Ile Sainte Marie off Madagascar, offering the pardon of the 1698 Act of Grace. Culliford and dozens of others surrendered. North, watching the negotiations from his hammock, smelled a trap. He was right, as Culliford's later arrest would prove. Rather than surrender, North took a longboat with a handful of loyal men and rowed for the Madagascar coast in the middle of the night. The boat capsized in a squall. Every man aboard drowned, except North. He surfaced, kicked off his boots, and swam through open ocean until he made landfall miles from anywhere. A native Malagasy woman found him half dead on the beach, clothed him, and led him 16 miles inland to a settlement of former pirates who took him in. Escape number 3. This one-half drowned and barefoot in a country where he did not speak the language. But North wasn't done. He continued pirating along the East African coast, for years afterward took the Charles under John Halsey, and was involved in the capture of 2 British East Indiamen, and reportedly survived at least one more shipwreck. In 1709, he finally retired to Madagascar with a fortune. The escape stopped only when his own in-laws murdered him around 1716, an ending that reads like grim proof that no matter how many press gangs, shipwrecks, jailers, and rope nooses a man outruns the ordinary treacheries of domestic life, always catch up in the end. Number 7, Roberto Cofresí. June 17th, 1791, a bright Sunday morning in Cabo Rojo on the western tip of Puerto Rico, and a merchant's wife gave birth to a son and named him Roberto Cofresí y Ramirez de Arellano. His father was an Austrian immigrant with a hyphenated name and a rough grasp of Spanish. His mother came from an old Puerto Rican family. Between the two of them, they raised a boy who spent his childhood in a boat listening to old sailors tell stories, and by his teens, he could outsail any fisherman on the coast. And here's what everyone missed. That fisherman's son was going to grow into the last great pirate of the Caribbean, and 6 different nations were going to spend the better part of a decade trying to catch him. Cofresí commanded fast, small draft sloops, most famously a 6-gun vessel called the Anne, and he crewed them mostly with Puerto Ricans, 10 to 20 men at a time. He preferred speed over guns. When Spanish, British, American, Danish, and French warships came looking for him, he simply outran them, ducked into mangrove creeks, or beached his sloop and vanished inland. In September 1824, Cofresí's crew took a Danish sloop near Isla Palomenos. The Danish government responded by dispatching a warship. Almost immediately afterward, a hurricane roared through the Antilles and drove Cofresí's own vessel onto the coast of Hispaniola. He and his men were captured by Spanish authorities in Santo Domingo and thrown into prison. That should have been the end. Instead, it was escape number 1. Cofresí and his men broke their locks, tore their clothes into strips, twisted them into ropes, and climbed down the prison walls. Not once, twice. They walked out of the same jail on 2 separate occasions, purchased another vessel with what money they still had hidden, and sailed back to Puerto Rico to set up a new hideout as if nothing had happened. The United States Navy was already after him. His raids had cost American merchants dearly, and the West Indies Squadron had been dispatched under Commodore David Porter to hunt Caribbean pirates. The USS Grampus, the USS Beagle, and the USS Weasel all searched for the Anne. The Grampus and the Beagle actually fought him at sea more than once and were unable to bring him in. On one occasion, the Weasel discovered a pirate sloop hidden in a cove and closed to engage. Cofresí and his men slipped into the dense mangroves and vegetation and disappeared before the American boarding party could reach the deck. Local Spanish patrols searched inland for weeks and never turned up a single man. Finally, Spain, Denmark, and the United States did something unprecedented for the era. They put aside their political differences and formed a tri-national alliance specifically to trap one pirate. On March 5, 1825, they set the trap. The USS Grampus, commanded by John Sloat and disguised as a commercial frigate to bait Cofresí into approach, sailed under Spanish and Danish sloop escort into the waters off Puerto Rico. Cofresí attacked. What he didn't know until he was in range was that the merchant ship was in fact a fully armed 12-gun schooner packed with 140 sailors and Marines. The naval battle that followed lasted 45 minutes. The Anne was overwhelmed. Cofresí abandoned his ship and fled overland, where a local resident recognized him and ambushed him with a machete, wounding him badly enough that Spanish troops caught up moments later. Even then, still bleeding, he tried a final escape. He offered a prison official part of a hidden cache of 4,000 pieces of 8 to look the other way. The official refused. On March 29, 1825, Roberto Cofresí was executed by firing squad in the fields in front of El Morro Castle at the age of 33. He died the way pirates die. But it took a warship pretending to be a merchant, an ambush, and a bribe that failed to finally close his file. Number 6, Charlotte Badger. April 29th, 1806, the government-chartered brig Venus sails out of Sydney Harbor bound for Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania, carrying supplies for the small British settlement at Port Dalrymple. Aboard her, among the deckhands, sailors, and a handful of convicts, is a woman named Charlotte Badger, 27 years old, English by birth, from a poor family in Bromsgrove, Worcestershire. She had been convicted at the Worcester Assizes in June 1796 of burglary, having broken into a house and stolen 4 guineas and a half crown. Sentenced to 7 years transportation, she had arrived in New South Wales in 1801. By 1806, she had served her time, given birth to an infant, daughter, and been placed aboard the Venus, most likely as a servant. What happened on the night of June 16, 1806, at Port Dalrymple has been argued about for 2 centuries. The bare facts are these. The captain of the Venus was ashore, several crew members and convicts took control of the ship. On July 20th, the Sydney Gazette published a notice describing Charlotte Badger as one of the mutineers, calling her a convict, very corpulent, with full face, thick lips, and light hair, has an infant child. Whether Charlotte was the ringleader, an accomplice, or simply a passenger swept up by the mutiny may never be settled. What is certain is that the Venus sailed east across the Tasman Sea and reached the Bay of Islands in New Zealand within a few weeks. The male mutineers deposited Charlotte, her daughter, another woman named Catherine Haggerty, and 2 of the men on shore then sailed away to Mercury Bay, where most of the crew were later killed by Maori. Charlotte was not among them. The local Ngapuhi Rangatira Tepahi and his people took the 2 women and the child under their protection. Both women were declared tapu, which meant no one was permitted to approach them, and they were given their own quarters. Catherine Haggerty died within months. Charlotte lived. And here's where the escape gets extraordinary. In 1807, Captain Bunker of the Elizabeth arrived in the Bay of Islands and offered Charlotte passage back to Sydney. She refused. She stayed. Some months later, Captain Turnbull of the Indispensable made a second offer. Some accounts say she accepted this. One. Others say she refused it too. What is documented is that a stout Englishwoman with a young daughter was seen in the Bay of Islands as late as 1808, still under Maori protection. Then she vanishes from the New Zealand record entirely. In 1826, 20 years after the Venus was seized, the American ship Lafayette called at Vavau in the Tongan Islands and returned with news that stunned the Sydney authorities. An American whaler had reportedly picked up a European woman at Vavau in 1818, a woman who spoke a Polynesian dialect fluently and told the Tongans she had lived among the Maori for 12 years. The description matched Charlotte. If the Lafayette's account is accurate, Charlotte Badger did what no other convict in Australian history did. She stepped out of the British imperial world entirely, first into Maori society, then into Tongan, and lived out her days somewhere in the Pacific, where no clerk with a ledger could reach her. She has no known grave. She has no record of death. Australia's first female pirate, if she was one at all, simply escaped through the horizon and never came back. Number 5, Laurens De Graaf. September 1685, the Bay of Campeche on the Yucatan coast of what is now Mexico. 2 Spanish warships have run down a Dutch buccaneer they know as Laurencillo, the Little Lorenz. His name is Laurens Cornelis Boudewang de Graaf, born around 1653 in Dordrecht in the Dutch Republic, and by 1685 he is arguably the most successful pirate the Caribbean has ever produced. He captured the Spanish frigate Tigra from the Armada de Barlovento with a smaller vessel in 1679. In 1682, he took the treasure ship Princesa off the coast, seizing 120,000 pesos in silver and losing only 8 or 9 of his own men in the fight. In 1683, he had led the raid on Veracruz that seized 1,300 African hostages and ransomed the town's governor. He was tall and blonde. He was known for his mustache. He carried a violin aboard his flagship and played it in the evenings. Spanish captains called him El Grif, and some of his own enemies whispered that he might be the devil incarnate. Now, in September 1685, the devil is being chased by 2 Spanish warships bigger than his own, in shallow water, on a coast he doesn't fully know, with treasure and hostages taken from the sack of Campeche stored in his holds. Their broadsides could sink him inside an hour, and here's where a lesser pirate would surrender. De Graaf did the opposite. He fought them for an entire day, tacking, luring, trading fire, and slowly working his ship toward waters he knew would favor him. When the wind died and left him becalmed on a flat, glassy sea within range of Spanish guns, he did the only thing left to do. He put his crew into the boats and had them tow his own ship, using oars and manpower alone, dragging her out of the killing zone under fire. As the Spanish warships tried to follow into the shallowing water, De Graaf ordered his men to throw the plunder overboard. Barrels of goods, trade cargo, ammunition, anything heavy. The ship rose in the water inch by inch, and then he began throwing the cannons overboard too, the very guns he had been using to fight with. Because a lighter ship drew less draft, and a shallower draft let him cross sandbars and shoals the deep-hulled Spanish warships could not. He crossed. They could not follow without grounding. And Laurens De Graaf sailed away over waters they physically could not reach. He had lost his prize. He had lost his cannons. He had lost most of what the Campeche raid had earned him. He kept his ship, his crew, and his life. And he lived to raid again, plundered Tiosuco in retaliation for a Spanish raid on his plantation, defend Saint-Domingue against invasions, and end his career not on a gallows but as a French colonial officer and eventually a settler near what is now Biloxi, Mississippi. He died a natural death in 1704. The Spanish had spent 25 years chasing him. What they never quite grasped was that he wasn't a fighter first. He was an escape artist first. The fighting was just how he made time to slip away. Number 4, Henry Morgan at Maracaibo. May 1st, 1669, dawn breaks over the narrow inlet where Lake Maracaibo empties into the Gulf of Venezuela. On the seaward side of the inlet, 3 Spanish warships ride at anchor. The 38-gun Magdalena, the 26-gun San Luis, and the 14-gun Marquesa, under the command of Vice Admiral Don Alonso del Campo y Espinosa. On a small island called Vigilias sits the fortress of San Carlos de la Barra, its cannons trained across the narrow channel. Inside the lake, trapped like a fish in a barrel, sits the fleet of the Welsh buccaneer Henry Morgan. His ships are smaller. His guns are fewer. His men are exhausted from weeks of plundering the towns of Maracaibo and Gibraltar, and they are now sitting on top of a mountain of Spanish gold, silver, and hostages that they will never see the outside of Venezuela with, unless they can somehow beat 3 warships and slip past a fortress. Don Alonso sent Morgan a letter. The terms were simple: surrender the plunder, and the hostages, and Morgan and his men would be permitted to leave with their lives. Refuse, and every last one of them would die. Morgan put the choice to his crew. His crew unanimously chose the second option. What followed was one of the most inventive naval escapes in the entire buccaneering era, and it worked in 2 stages. Stage 1 was the fire ship. Morgan took one of his smallest ships, a captured Cuban vessel, and had his men hollow out logs, dress them in the shirts and hats of pirates, and stand them at the gun ports. He loaded the deck with gunpowder, tar, palm leaves, and brimstone. He built false gun barrels from painted wooden pipes so that from a distance the ship looked bristling with cannons and packed with crew. At dawn on May 1st, Morgan's fleet advanced on the Spanish warships as if he intended a straight naval battle. The disguised vessel led the way. As it closed on the Magdalena, the Spanish flagship, its true crew, leapt overboard into a longboat trailing behind, and the fireship's fuses caught. The whole vessel became a floating bomb that grappled onto the Magdalena and set her ablaze. Within minutes, the flagship was burning down to the waterline. The Magdalena sank. The San Luis, seeing what had happened, was run aground and set alight by her own crew rather than be captured. The Marquesa was boarded and taken. Don Alonso escaped to the fortress of San Carlos, but Stage 1 wasn't the escape. Stage 1 was just clearing the killing ground. The fortress still stood. Its cannons still commanded the only channel out of the lake, and Morgan's ships still had to sail past those guns in daylight, packed with plunder that would make them ride low in the water and slow. This is where the pirate mind revealed itself. Morgan sent word to the town of Maracaibo demanding a further ransom. It was paid. Then he had every one of his boats loaded with men and pushed off toward the shore near the fortress, rowing openly for the beach in what appeared to be preparation for a land assault. Once the boats reached the shore, the men would drop below the gunwales as if hiding themselves in the sand and scrub. Then, still crouched, they rowed the empty-looking boats back to the ships on the far side, where they climbed aboard unseen. Then they did it again. Boat after boat, hour after hour, hundreds of pirates appeared to be ferrying themselves ashore, but almost every one of them was rowing back invisibly. The garrison of San Carlos concluded that a night assault on the land side of the fortress was imminent, and Don Alonso ordered every heavy cannon dragged around and re-emplaced facing the landward wall. That night, when the tide turned, Morgan's fleet slipped anchor without setting sails and drifted silently down the channel with the current. Only when they were past the fort did they raise canvas. By the time the Spanish gunners realized what was happening and swung their guns back toward the water, Morgan was out of range. He had destroyed a Spanish squadron with a fake ship, then escaped the fortress with a fake landing, then sailed home to Port Royal without firing a shot on the way out. The Spanish crown demanded satisfaction. Instead, London eventually knighted him. Number 3. Bartholomew Sharp. April 1682, an English courtroom, and the Spanish ambassador Don Pedro Ronquillo is having what any modern diplomat would recognize as a very bad afternoon. He has spent months pressing the English crown to arrest, try and hang a pirate named Bartholomew Sharp for the murder of a Spanish captain and the seizure of a Spanish ship called the El Santo Rosario off the coast of what is now Ecuador. He has witnesses. He has evidence. He has 2 crewmen willing to testify. And he watches, jaw clenched, as an English jury acquits Sharp on the spot in the face of testimony that would have hanged any ordinary sailor twice over. What Ronquillo doesn't know, because it is a closely guarded state secret, is that the trial has been quietly manipulated at the highest level. King Charles II has instructed his officers to postpone Sharp's court appearance. He has instructed the Duke of Albemarle to acquire what Sharp took from the Rosario, translate it, and copy it. And he has done this because Sharp has, on his 1680 to 1682 voyage around the Pacific coast of South America, stolen the most valuable single object in all of Spain's Pacific Empire, a derrotero, a Spanish sea atlas. To grasp what a derrotero was, imagine that today an American pirate captured the master navigational database of the entire United States Coast Guard, complete with soundings, harbor sketches, shoal warnings, wind observations, and the precise positions of every fortified port. That is what Sharp took. The Spanish crown had guarded the derrotero of the South Sea, the Pacific coast, from Acapulco all the way down to Cape Horn so jealously that they executed men for leaking single pages. It contained the accumulated navigational knowledge of the Manila galleon trade, the Peruvian silver fleet, and the entire viceroyalty of New Spain. When Sharp and his men took the El Santo Rosario on July 29, 1681, off the coast of Ecuador, the Spanish captain saw the derrotero in the hands of the boarding party and reportedly wept, knowing that Spain's Pacific monopoly might not survive the loss. Sharp knew what he had. He is often painted as a mediocre pirate, a violent man who took too little treasure to justify his voyage, but he was a superb navigator, and he understood at a glance that this book, more than any silver, was going to keep him alive when he reached London. He brought it home. When the Spanish ambassador demanded a hanging Sharp, arranged for the atlas to be presented at court. King Charles II personally saw the pages. He ordered William Hack, a London mapmaker, to have it translated into English by one of Sharp's own sailors, a man named Philip de Signy. Copies of the resulting South Sea Wagoner were then presented back to the king in a magnificent, illuminated version. It became the foundational chart of English Pacific navigation for the next century. And Bartholomew Sharp walked out of the Old Bailey, a free man, acquitted, despite 2 witnesses giving compelling testimony against him because the king had already privately decided that the atlas was worth more than the pirate. Ronquillo returned to Madrid empty-handed. In fact, the affair became such an embarrassment to Spanish diplomacy that the English ambassador in Madrid was subsequently expelled on what everyone understood to be a trumped-up pretext. Sharp had committed piracy in the highest sense of the word. He had stolen not just cargo, but the state secret of an empire, and he had used it to buy his own life. He later returned to buccaneering, was eventually caught in Nevis in the West Indies, and died in prison there in 1702. But the derrotero he stole, the pages that saved his neck, remained in English hands. Spain never got them back. Number 2. Robert Culliford. If William Kidd's name is engraved on the wall of every pirate history museum in the English-speaking world, the name of the man who ruined him is often not even present. And yet it was Robert Culliford, more than any admiral or governor, who broke Kidd's fortunes, then coolly walked away from his own trial while Kidd walked to the rope. Culliford was born around 1666 in East Looe, Cornwall. He first appears in the historical record in 1689 as a British sailor aboard the French privateer St. Rose, alongside William Kidd, Samuel Burgess, and 5 other Englishmen. When the War of the Grand Alliance began, the 8 of them mutinied against their French captain, seized the ship, and renamed her the Blessed William. Kidd became captain. Within months, Culliford led a second mutiny, this one against Kidd himself, stealing the Blessed William out from under him and sailing off to the Caribbean with the treasure. That betrayal alone would have made them lifelong enemies. But Culliford wasn't finished. In 1698, when Kidd finally arrived at the pirate haven of Ile Sainte-Marie off Madagascar, aboard the adventure galley to hunt down the very pirates his London backers had commissioned him to catch, he found Culliford there in command of the Mocha frigate. Instead of arresting his old enemy, Kidd's own crew mutinied a second time and joined Culliford. Kidd was left with a handful of loyal men and a rotting ship. Culliford then sailed out with the reinforced crew, joined forces with Dirk Chivers and Joseph Wheeler, and in September of 1698, captured the Great Mohammed in the Red Sea, seizing 130,000 pounds in gold coins. One of the greatest single acts of piracy in the entire era. When the British government's 1698 Act of Grace was extended to all pirates east of the Cape of Good Hope, with the sole exceptions of William Kidd and Henry Every, Culliford accepted the pardon. Commodore Thomas Warren arrived at Sainte Marie with 4 warships and offered terms. Culliford surrendered under the pardon and sailed back toward England a free man. Except he wasn't. His pardon was ruled invalid on a technicality. The wording of the Act of Grace, according to the Crown's lawyers, did not cover his piracy against the Great Mohammed, which was viewed as a diplomatic incident with the Mughal Emperor of India rather than a straightforward Red Sea prize. Culliford was arrested on August 1st, 1700, and locked in Marshalsea Prison in London. He was tried in the same 1701 session that saw William Kidd tried and like Kidd. He was found guilty of piracy and sentenced to hang. And here is where the escape becomes an escape, not of walls, not of chains, but of the English legal calendar. Kidd's trial ran ahead of his. Kidd was convicted, condemned, and dragged to execution dock in Wapping on May 23, 1701, where the rope broke on the first attempt, and he had to be hanged a second time. His body was tarred and hung in a gibbet along the Thames as a warning to sailors. Meanwhile, Culliford's execution date approached. Then, almost at the last moment, the Crown's prosecutors realized they still needed him alive. Samuel Burgess, one of the original mutineers from the St. Rose in 1689, had been captured too, and the case against Burgess depended almost entirely on Culliford's testimony. If Culliford was hanged, Burgess walked. So Culliford stayed alive. He testified against Burgess, who was convicted though later pardoned. And then, in April 1702, Robert Culliford was quietly released from custody, not pardoned, not acquitted, released. He vanished from the historical record almost as completely as Henry Every had. Rumor placed him in the Royal Navy sailing to the West Indies. Rumor placed him living obscurely in England as late as 1706. What is known is that Culliford, having ruined Kidd, twice having stolen his ship, and then his crew having taken one of the largest single prizes in pirate history, and having been convicted of piracy in the same session as the most famous pirate in the English-speaking world, was the one who walked away. And Kidd, whose only crime by the end was arguably being useful to the English state as a scapegoat, was the one who hanged. Number 1, Jean Bart. Which brings us finally to the man whose story opened this video. Because everything you have heard tonight, canvas boats, and legal loopholes, becalmed seas, and fake landings, atlases and neck versus pails, beside what Jean Bart did in the summer of 1689, and what he did to the English Navy for the rest of his career. Born in Dunkirk on October 21st, 1650, into a family of Flemish fishermen and privateers, Jean Bart may have spoken Dutch as his first language since his father served as a soldier under the Dutch Admiral Michiel de Ruyter and died in 1668 fighting the English. When France went to war with the Dutch in 1672, Bart returned home to Dunkirk and threw himself into the French privateering trade using his intimate knowledge of the North Sea coast to take an astonishing 81 prizes in only 6 running battles. King Louis XIV personally noticed him and made him a lieutenant of the French Navy, an unusual honor for a commoner. Then, in 1689, during the War of the Grand Alliance, Bart and his aristocratic sidekick Claude de Forbin led two small French ships in a rearguard action against a superior English force in the Channel, protecting a French convoy while sacrificing themselves. The convoy escaped. Bart and Forbin were captured, and Jean Bart, along with Forbin and 20 other French sailors, was taken to Plymouth on the south coast of England and locked in a prison cell to await either exchange or execution. Plymouth, deep in the belly of English naval power, guarded by the finest navy in the world in a harbor patrolled day and night in a country at war with Bart's own. There was no plan for rescue. The French Navy had no way to reach him. Bart was 39 years old, an experienced sea captain in captivity in a city built specifically to keep men like him out of French waters. What happens next takes exactly 3 days. Bart and Forbin somehow acquired a metal file. Some accounts say a French woman living in Plymouth smuggled it to them. Others say they bribed a guard. Either way, they used it. In the dark of a summer night, working in shifts, so as not to make continuous noise, they sawed through the bars of their prison cell. Then they lowered themselves into the streets of a hostile English port wearing whatever clothes they could steal and made their way to the harbor. There they took a small fishing boat, a rowing boat, no sail worth speaking of. And in this boat, Jean Bart, Claude de Forbin, and 20 other French sailors pushed off into the English Channel. The channel, at that point between Plymouth and the coast of Brittany, runs roughly 100 miles across open water, in some of the most contested and most heavily patrolled seas in Europe. English frigates crisscrossed it daily. Fishing fleets covered the coasts. A boat as small as theirs, packed with too many men, could have been swamped by any strong swell, and they had no charts, no compass, no food beyond what they could snatch on the way out, and no way to sail. So they rowed for 52 hours straight by Britannica's account, for 2.5 days by most others, through the fast-running tides of the Western Channel, past English cruisers whose lookouts must have squinted at them across the waves and dismissed them as fishermen, through nights so dark they could see nothing but stars, and days so hot the salt burned their lips, through the exhaustion of muscles that had done nothing but rot in a cell for weeks. And on the third day, they made landfall just outside St. Malo on the coast of Brittany. When French sentries, whose job was to prevent Huguenot Protestants from fleeing France, first spotted them staggering up the beach, they nearly opened fire. Then, someone recognized Bart, and someone told him that news had already reached France that he was dead, killed in the fight in the Channel weeks before. He was, in effect, being greeted by his own countrymen as a ghost. King Louis XIV received the news personally. Bart was promoted immediately to captain and given command of the frigate Alcyon, which he later took into the Battle of Beachy Head in July 1690, a French tactical victory in which 11 English and Dutch ships were lost for no French loss at all. From 1691 onward, whenever the English blockaded Dunkirk with a squadron intended to bottle up French shipping, Bart simply led his ships out at night, sometimes firing broadsides at the blockaders as he passed, and then destroyed their trade for weeks at a time in the North Sea. In June of 1694, at a moment when 2 successive grain harvests had failed and France was starving, Bart intercepted a Dutch convoy escorting Russian and Polish grain and, in a running battle, captured 96 grain ships and brought them home to feed his country. For that he was ennobled, made a Chevalier de St. Louis, and became, in his own lifetime, a legend. Over his career, he took an estimated 386 enemy vessels. The English never got over the humiliation of Plymouth. They had captured the greatest French sea raider of the age, held him in one of their most secure ports, and lost him to a metal file and a fishing boat, and 100 miles of open sea, and 2.5 days of raw human strength. And here is the strangest fact of them all. Jean Bart died in his own bed in Dunkirk on April 27, 1702, of pneumonia. Not on a scaffold, not at sea, not in prison, in his bed. The man they could not hold in a cell, the man who outrode the fastest navy in Europe, the man who fed France by seizing Dutch grain ships, died the way men are supposed to die, at home with his family beside him. That is the last impossible escape, escaping the destiny that the sea holds for every one of the men on this list. All the others died in battle, or on ropes, or in mysterious waters, or by the hands of their in-laws. Bart alone slipped that final knot too. 10 pirates. 10 escapes that should not have been possible. Jean Bart rode 100 miles across a war. Robert Culliford let the calendar hang his rival for him. Bartholomew Sharp traded a stolen atlas for his own life. Henry Morgan turned a fake landing into an open channel. Laurens De Graaf threw his own cannons overboard to lighten a ship the Spanish could not follow. Charlotte Badger walked out of the British Empire and into the horizon. Roberto Cofresí climbed down a prison wall on a rope made of his own clothes twice. Nathaniel North swam through the sharks and the press gangs. William Oakley stitched a boat out of canvas in a cellar in Algiers. And one anonymous English pirate somewhere in the 1600s simply recited a psalm and walked home. Every one of them changed the way the world tried to catch pirates afterward. Governments closed loopholes, prisons rebuilt walls, navies stopped underestimating small boats. And every generation of pirates that followed learned the same brutal truth. The sea is patient, the rope is patient, but so, sometimes, is the pirate who refuses to accept the ending everyone has written for him. Which of these escapes was the boldest? Drop it in the comments right now and tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans the entire globe, and you're part of what makes this channel what it is. If this video changed how you see the golden age of piracy, smash that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to send this to more history fans like you. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one in the series. And if you like this countdown, we have more pirate stories waiting for you on the channel, from the lost treasures no one has ever found, to the female pirates history tried to bury, to the raids that changed the Caribbean forever. Thank you for watching. These men and women lived and died on the strength of their nerve and their wit, and they deserve to be remembered for what they actually did, not just for what Hollywood made of them. We'll see you in the next one.